Sweden, 1314. The cold Nordic wind howls outside a stone chapel as a 10-year-old girl kneels alone before a wooden crucifix. The candles flicker, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the world is wrapped in the long darkness of a Scandinavian winter. But inside this small chapel, something is about to happen that will send ripples across 7 centuries of human history. The girl's name is Birgitta. Birgitta Bergersdotter, daughter of one of Sweden's most powerful noblemen. She should be in the great hall with her family, warming herself by the fire, learning the ways of courtly life. Instead, she kneels here alone, drawn by something she cannot name, pulled toward this crucifix by a force she cannot explain. And then the impossible happens. The figure on the cross begins to move. The carved wood seems to breathe. Blood appears fresh on the wounds, vivid, red, impossibly real. The chapel fills with a presence so overwhelming that young Birgitta can barely breathe. A voice speaks directly to her soul, not to her ears, to something deeper, something that resonates in the very core of her being. "Look at me, my daughter," the voice says. Birgitta looks. She sees every wound, every drop of blood, every mark of suffering. She feels a sorrow so profound it threatens to consume her. And from that sorrow rises a question. The question that would define her entire existence. The question that would eventually lead to prophecies that still shake the world today. "Who has done this to you?" she whispers. The answer comes like thunder wrapped in silk, terrifying and tender all at once. "All those who despise me and spurn my love for them." This moment changed everything. Not just for Birgitta, who would grow to become Saint Bridget of Sweden, one of the most influential mystics in Christian history. Not just for the Church, which would spend centuries examining and ultimately approving her extraordinary revelations, but potentially for all of humanity. Because what this young girl would go on to see, hear, and record over the next 6 decades of her life would include warnings so specific, so detailed, and so eerily accurate that they continue to command attention from believers and skeptics alike. Warnings about the end of ages. Warnings about the Antichrist. Warnings about signs that would precede the final judgment. And most dramatically, warnings that some believe point directly to our current era. Warnings that mention specific signs converging in the years we are living through right now. Warnings that have led countless people to whisper about a date that keeps appearing in discussions of her prophecies. 2026. But before we can understand what she saw about our times, we need to understand who she was. Because this wasn't some medieval peasant prone to fantasy. This wasn't an attention seeker inventing stories for fame. This was a woman whose visions would be scrutinized by popes, examined by church councils, and ultimately confirmed by the highest ecclesiastical authorities. This was a woman whose prophecies came true with such startling accuracy that she predicted the exact boundaries of Vatican City, more than 500 years before Mussolini drew them on a map. So what exactly did she see about the years we're living through right now? What warning did she leave echoing across the centuries for us? The answer might terrify you. It might inspire you. It might change how you understand everything happening in our world today. But one thing is absolutely certain. After you hear what Saint Bridget said, you will never look at the world or at your own life quite the same way again. Stay with me, because this story is just beginning. To truly grasp the weight and significance of Saint Bridget's prophecies, you first need to understand who this woman was. Because this wasn't just any mystic claiming divine visions. This was someone whose extraordinary life reads like the plot of an epic saga, complete with royal blood, tragedy, profound transformation, and divine encounters that would reshape the course of European history. Birgitta Bergersdotter was born around 1303 into one of the most powerful and influential families in all of Sweden. Her father, Birger Persson, served as governor and law speaker of Uppland, positions that made him one of the most important figures in the Swedish realm. He was a man of deep faith who went to confession every Friday and made arduous pilgrimages as far as the Holy Land. Her mother, Ingeborg Bengtsdotter, was directly connected to the Swedish royal family through the powerful Folkunga clan. Little Birgitta wasn't just nobility, she was practically royalty, surrounded by wealth and privilege that most medieval Europeans could scarcely imagine. But even from her earliest years, something marked Birgitta as profoundly different from other noble children. While her peers played games of courtly intrigue, practiced their social graces, and prepared for advantageous marriages, young Birgitta was drawn to something deeper, something that seemed to call to her from beyond the visible world. She spent hours in prayer when other children were at play. She sought out the poor and sick to help them, even when it wasn't expected or particularly convenient. She asked questions about God and salvation that surprised the priests who taught her. And most significantly, she had those visions, those terrifying, beautiful, world-shaking visions that began when she was barely 7 years old. At 7, she saw the Virgin Mary approach her in a dream and place a crown upon her head. It wasn't a crown of gold or jewels. It was something more precious, something spiritual, a mark of a calling she couldn't yet understand. At 10 came the vision in the chapel, the encounter with the suffering Christ that would define her entire spiritual life. From that moment forward, the Passion of Jesus became the center of her existence, the lens through which she would view everything else. Yet despite these profound mystical experiences, young Birgitta followed the path expected of a noblewoman of her station. At 13, an age when many medieval noble girls were married, she wed Ulf Gudmarsson, an 18-year-old nobleman who served as law speaker of Östergötland. It was, by all accounts, a happy marriage. Ulf shared his young wife's deep faith, and together they would build a life centered on both noble duty and spiritual devotion. Over the following years, Birgitta bore 8 children, 4 sons and 4 daughters. 6 of them survived infancy, which was remarkably rare in that era of high childhood mortality. One of her daughters, Catherine, would herself become a saint, continuing her mother's spiritual legacy. The young family rose to even greater prominence when Birgitta was appointed as principal lady-in-waiting to Queen Blanche of Namur, wife of King Magnus IV. She served at the royal court, advising the queen and attempting, often unsuccessfully, to steer the king and his court toward more virtuous lives. It was a position of tremendous influence, but Birgitta never lost sight of what she believed truly mattered. For decades, she balanced the competing demands of family, royal court, and her ever-deepening spiritual life. She was a wife, a mother, a courtier, and a mystic all at once, navigating each role with remarkable grace while the visions continued to come, growing more frequent and more intense with each passing year. But God, it seemed, had other plans for Birgitta Bergersdotter. In 1341, she and Ulf made a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, one of medieval Christianity's most important holy sites. The journey was long and dangerous, and during it, Ulf fell gravely ill. He recovered enough to complete the pilgrimage and return home, but he was never the same. In 1344, after 28 years of marriage, Ulf died in the Cistercian monastery of Alvastra, and with his death, something within Birgitta broke free. The wife and mother transformed. The courtier disappeared. In her place emerged something far more powerful, far more focused, far more dangerous to the comfortable complacency of the world. A prophet. She traded her fine silk gowns for the rough garments of a religious penitent. She replaced her jewels with a hair shirt worn against her skin as constant penance. She gave away her vast wealth, distributing it among her children and the poor. And she opened herself completely to the visions that had pursued her throughout her entire life. What came next would fill 8 volumes and hundreds of pages with revelations, prophecies, and divine messages. These weren't vague mystical impressions or fuzzy spiritual feelings. They were specific, detailed, and verifiable. They would be scrutinized, debated, and ultimately accepted by the Catholic Church as authentic encounters with the divine. Picture Rome in 1349. The Black Death is ravaging Europe, killing tens of millions, leaving entire villages empty, creating a crisis of faith and meaning that shakes Christendom to its foundations. The papal court has abandoned the Eternal City for the relative safety of Avignon in southern France, leaving Rome to decay. Its great churches crumbling, its streets haunted by plague and poverty. Into this maelstrom of chaos and despair walks a 46-year-old Swedish widow with a message she claims comes directly from Jesus Christ himself. Bridget had received clear, unmistakable instructions in her visions. Go to Rome. Wait there. The Pope must return to his rightful seat. And so she went, traveling across a Europe devastated by plague, not knowing she would remain in that broken city for nearly 25 years, until her death in 1373. During this quarter-century in Rome, the revelations poured forth like water from an inexhaustible spring. Christ spoke to her about his life, his suffering, his love for humanity. The Virgin Mary appeared regularly. Saints delivered messages. Even demons were forced to reveal truths in her presence. Bridget didn't keep these experiences to herself. She recorded everything, or rather, her confessors did. Master Matthias, a holy theologian and canon of Linköping who had been her spiritual director in Sweden, and Prior Peter Olafsson of Alvastra, translated her Swedish visions into Latin for the wider church. They worked carefully, meticulously, aware that they were dealing with something of potentially enormous importance. The Revelaciones Coelestes, the celestial revelations, became medieval bestsellers in an era before the printing press. They were copied by hand in monastery scriptoriums across Europe. They were read by kings and peasants, by bishops and simple priests, by scholars and the illiterate alike. They spread from Scandinavia to Italy, from England to the Eastern kingdoms, touching countless lives and shaping religious consciousness across the continent. Pope Gregory XIII confirmed the authenticity and value of her revelations. Pope Boniface IX praised them in official church documents. The Council of Basel, after extensive examination, declared their orthodoxy in 1436, ensuring they would remain an accepted part of Catholic spiritual literature for centuries to come. But here's what makes Bridget's prophecies truly unique among the many mystics and visionaries of Christian history. They weren't just spiritual guidance or moral exhortations. They weren't merely calls to prayer and penance. Many of them were specific, concrete predictions about future events. Predictions that came true with uncanny, almost unsettling accuracy. She prophesied that Pope Urban Phelps and Emperor Charles IV would meet amicably in Rome. The two powerful leaders did indeed meet in 1368, exactly as she had described years earlier. She warned Pope Urban V that his death was approaching, giving him specific information about the time he had left. He died 4 months later, just as she had indicated. She foresaw that the popes would eventually abandon Avignon and return to Rome, ending the so-called Babylonian captivity of the Church. They did, in 1377, just a few years after her death. But perhaps her most stunning verified prediction concerned something that wouldn't happen for more than half a millennium after her death: the creation of Vatican City as an independent state. In the 14th century, when the Papal States sprawled across central Italy, and the Pope was one of the most powerful temporal rulers in Europe, Bridget described a future where the pontiff would rule over a tiny territory, reportedly indicating almost the exact boundaries that would eventually be drawn in 1929 when Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty. 500 years before it happened, down to the specific borders. Think about that for a moment. She saw, in precise detail, a political arrangement that no one in the 14th century could have imagined. And it came to pass exactly as she described. This is why her other prophecies, the ones about the end times, the ones about the Antichrist, the ones some believe point to our current era, demand serious attention. When someone has a track record of supernatural accuracy like this, you don't casually dismiss what they said about the future, especially when that future might be now. Now we come to the prophecies that have made Saint Bridget a topic of intense discussion and even controversy in our own time. The warnings about the Antichrist, the signs of the end, the timeline that some believe points directly to the years we are living through right now. According to compilations of her prophecies that have circulated for centuries, Bridget received detailed, vivid visions about how humanity would recognize the approaching time of the Antichrist. The signs she described are chilling in their contemporary resonance, almost disturbingly so when you read them today. The time of this Antichrist, well known to me, will come when iniquity and impiety shall above measure abound, she reportedly wrote. When injustice shall have filled the measure to overflowing, and wickedness shall have grown to immeasurable proportions. The prophecy continues with even more specific indicators. The time of Antichrist will be near when the measure of injustice will overflow and when wickedness has grown to immense proportions, when Christians love heresies and the unjust trample underfoot the servants of God. Stop for a moment and consider those words carefully. Consider them not as ancient religious text, but as a description of conditions you might observe yourself. Christians loving heresies, the unjust trampling the servants of God, wickedness growing to immeasurable proportions, injustice overflowing. How many people, looking honestly at our world today, at our media, our politics, our culture, our institutions, would say these conditions haven't been met? How many would argue that we live in an age of growing righteousness and justice? How many would claim that traditional Christian teaching is respected and upheld in the public square? But Bridget didn't stop with these general signs. She provided startlingly specific details about the Antichrist himself, details that read like a dark, inverted mirror of Christ's own incarnation story. At the end of this age, the Antichrist will be born, she wrote. As Christ was born from the highest type of womanhood, so Antichrist will be born from the lowest. He will be a child wonder at birth. His mother will be an accursed woman who will pretend to be well-informed in spiritual things, and his father will be an accursed man, from the seed of whom the devil shall form his work. Notice the careful parallels. Christ came from Mary, the purest and holiest of women. The Antichrist will come from the most corrupt. Christ's birth was heralded by angels and attended by humble shepherds and wise kings. The Antichrist's birth will be marked by false spirituality. His mother pretending to be knowledgeable in spiritual matters while actually serving darkness. The prophecy continues with details about the Antichrist's reign that have fascinated and terrified readers for centuries. He will reign during 3 years and shall have dominion over the whole earth. 3 years. Global dominion. A figure born from spiritual deception and demonic influence. A world so steeped in wickedness, so saturated with injustice, that it willingly embraces its own destroyer. These prophecies have circulated for centuries, discussed in monasteries and universities, in religious communities and private homes. But why are they suddenly receiving such renewed and intense attention? Why are people across the world, believers of various traditions, researchers, and even secular observers, whispering about Saint Bridget and the year 2026? The answer lies in another prophecy, one that involves a mysterious alignment of liturgical dates and a chilling pronouncement of worldwide woe. Among the many prophecies attributed to Saint Bridget, one has captured particular attention in recent years due to its specific, verifiable nature. It involves a precise alignment of feast days on the liturgical calendar that supposedly marks the beginning of apocalyptic events. According to this prophecy, when the feast of Saint Mark shall fall on Easter, the feast of Saint Anthony on Pentecost, and that of Saint John on Corpus Christi, the whole world shall cry, "Woe!" This cryptic prediction has sent researchers, calendar experts, and prophecy enthusiasts scrambling to their computations. Let's break down what it means and when these conditions are fulfilled. The feast of Saint Mark the Evangelist falls on April 25th every year. For it to coincide with Easter Sunday requires Easter to fall on its latest possible date. April 25th is the latest date Easter can occur under the current calendar system. Saint Anthony of Padua's feast day is celebrated on June 13th. Saint John the Baptist's nativity is observed on June 24th. For all three conditions to be met simultaneously requires a specific and rare calendar alignment. Researchers have calculated that since Bridget's lifetime in the 14th century, Easter has fallen on April 25th in only a handful of years: 1451, 1546, 1666, 1734, 1886, and 1943. Each of these years, intriguingly, saw significant historical upheavals and transformations. When is the next occurrence? The year 2038. Now, we need to be absolutely honest here about what we know and what we don't know. Spirit Daily, a Catholic news site that has investigated these claims extensively, explicitly states, "We can't even confirm that it's from Saint Bridget." The original source of this particular prophecy within her authenticated revelations has not been definitively identified. It may be genuinely hers, or it may be a later addition that became attached to her name over the centuries. This matters because truth matters, even when, especially when, we're dealing with subjects this significant. But this uncertainty hasn't stopped the prophecy from circulating widely, and it hasn't stopped people from connecting it to other prophetic traditions that point to the same general time period, the years surrounding 2025 to 2040. So where does 2026 specifically come into this picture? This is where Saint Bridget's prophecies intersect with a broader, deeper stream of Catholic prophetic tradition. Multiple seers and visionaries from various centuries, from both approved and still under investigation apparition sites, have pointed to the years between 2025 and 2030 as a period of extraordinary spiritual and historical significance. The Garabandal visionaries, 4 young girls who experienced alleged apparitions in northern Spain during the early 1960s, spoke of a great warning and miracle that would occur within Conchita's lifetime. Conchita Gonzalez was born in 1949, making her 77 years old in 2026. The warning, according to these seers, would be a worldwide event allowing every person on earth to see the state of their soul before God. Marie-Julie Jahenny, a 19th century French stigmatist whose cause for beatification has been opened, reportedly referenced a period spanning from the 1960s to 2026 as a time of intensifying spiritual warfare. Other mystics have spoken of the same general time frame as a period of decision, of warning, of opportunity for repentance before more severe events unfold. Saint Bridget's prophecies, then, don't stand alone on an isolated island. They're part of a vast, interconnected tapestry of Catholic prophetic tradition that seems to converge, from multiple directions across multiple centuries, on our present moment in history. The question that haunts many who study these matters: is this convergence coincidental? Or is it meaningful? And if it's meaningful, what exactly should we expect? What did Bridget and these other seers believe would happen when these times finally arrived? Among the most dramatic and disturbing prophecies attributed to Saint Bridget is one that speaks of destruction coming to the eternal city itself, to Rome, the seat of the Catholic Church, the spiritual center of Western Christianity for nearly 2,000 years. Rome will be visited by sword and fire and plowed under, the prophecy states with stark, terrible clarity. These words have resonated with particular intensity in recent decades. As geopolitical tensions have risen across Europe and the Middle East, as terrorism has touched European capitals with devastating effect, as the specter of broader conflict between great powers looms larger with each passing year, many have wondered, is this prophecy approaching its fulfillment? But to understand this prophecy properly, to grasp what Bridget was actually saying and why, we need to place it in its fuller context within her revelations. Throughout her visions and messages, Bridget consistently, relentlessly, fearlessly called for reform within the Catholic Church. She confronted popes directly, telling them hard truths that few others dared to speak. She criticized bishops who lived in luxury while their flocks suffered. She denounced clergy who violated their vows, who neglected their duties, who served themselves rather than Christ. She demanded that the papal court return to Rome from Avignon, insisting that the Pope's absence was causing incalculable spiritual harm. Her prophecies of destruction were never standalone declarations of doom. They were always paired with urgent calls to repentance. They showed what would happen if humanity failed to change course. They were warnings, not inevitable destinies. They revealed possible futures that could still be averted through prayer, penance, and genuine conversion of heart. This is crucial to understanding how the Catholic Church approaches prophecy. Unlike some religious traditions that view the future as fixed, unchangeable, already determined, Catholic teaching holds that many, perhaps most, prophecies are conditional. They show trajectories, directions, likely outcomes if current patterns continue. But they don't eliminate human freedom or divine mercy. Consider the prophet Jonah in the Old Testament. God sent him to Nineveh with a simple, terrifying message. In 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. There were no qualifications, no conditions stated, just stark prophecy of destruction. But what happened? The people of Nineveh, from the king to the humblest citizen, repented. They fasted. They prayed. They turned from their evil ways. And God relented. The destruction didn't come. Jonah was furious, feeling that God had made him look like a false prophet. But God explained, His mercy is greater than human understanding. When people genuinely change, the predicted consequences of their sins can be averted. Saint Bridget's warnings carry this same conditional quality. They're not fatalistic pronouncements of unavoidable catastrophe. They're not predictions to observe passively while waiting for the inevitable. They're urgent, desperate calls to conversion. They're divine warnings meant to shake humanity out of complacency, to wake us up before it's too late. And perhaps this is precisely why they feel so relevant, so pressing, so urgent in our current moment. Because our world seems desperately, obviously, painfully in need of exactly such shaking. Before we go further, we need to address a critical question. What does the Catholic Church actually say about Saint Bridget's revelations? The answer is both nuanced and important. Bridget was canonized in 1391 by Pope Boniface IX, relatively quickly after her death in 1373. The Council of Constance confirmed her canonization in 1415. The Council of Basel declared the orthodoxy of her revelations in 1436. Then, in 1999, Pope John Paul II declared her one of the 6 patron saints of Europe. This represents extraordinary ecclesiastical approval. Very few private revelations in church history have received such consistent endorsement across centuries. However, and this is crucial, the Church's approval comes with an important clarification. In his 2010 general audience, Pope Benedict XVI quoted Pope John Paul II. The Church, without ever pronouncing on her individual revelations, has accepted the overall authenticity of her interior experience. What does this mean? The Church affirms Bridget was a genuine mystic, with authentic divine encounters. Her revelations contain nothing contrary to faith. But Catholics aren't required to believe every specific prediction or detail. Private revelations, even approved ones, aren't equivalent to Scripture. This is wise. It honors genuine spiritual gifts while maintaining humility about human limitations. Even authentic mystics can misunderstand details or express truths imperfectly. So we examine Bridget's words with both faith and prudence. We take them seriously without treating them as infallible. We allow them to challenge and inspire us, without letting them terrorize us into paralysis. Now, some of you might be thinking, every generation believes it's living in the end times. And you'd be right to think that. The early Christians expected Christ to return in their lifetimes. Medieval believers saw the Black Death and wondered if the end had come. Our grandparents watched atomic bombs fall and questioned humanity's survival. And here we are. The world continues. History unfolds. Christ has not returned. So why should we take these prophecies seriously now? Why does this moment feel different? 3 reasons stand out. First, the convergence. It's not just Bridget pointing to this general time frame. It's multiple mystics across multiple centuries from multiple countries with no way of coordinating with each other, all pointing to the same general period. Garabandal in the 1960s, Marie-Julie Jeheni in the 19th century. The approved messages of Fatima with their references to Russia and apostasy. When independent sources converge on the same target, it demands attention. Consider what this means. A 14th century Swedish noblewoman, a 19th century French peasant, 20th century Spanish children, and the 3 shepherd children of Fatima, separated by centuries and thousands of miles, all describing remarkably similar scenarios. All pointing toward the same general era, all warning of the same dangers. The mathematical probability of this being coincidental should give any thoughtful person pause. Second, the specificity of the signs. Previous generations saw wars and plagues and thought the end was near. But they didn't see global communication networks that could enable worldwide deception in real time. They didn't see technology that could track every person on Earth. They didn't see artificial intelligence that could mimic human thought and potentially deceive on a scale never before possible. Most importantly, they didn't see the specific combination of factors Bridget described. Widespread apostasy within Christianity itself, not just persecution from outside. When she wrote of Christians loving heresies, she wasn't describing a future where Christianity would be attacked by external enemies. She was describing a future where the rot would come from within, where people calling themselves Christians would reject the very faith they claimed to profess. Look around. How many churches have abandoned teachings that were universal for 2,000 years? How many Christians treat their faith as a cultural identity rather than a transformative encounter with the living God? The apostasy Bridget foresaw isn't coming. It's here. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the acceleration. History seems to be speeding up. Changes that once took centuries now happen in decades. Changes that took decades now happen in years. The moral and spiritual landscape that existed even 20 years ago has been transformed beyond recognition. In 2005, virtually every major institution in the Western world held certain moral positions. By 2025, those same institutions have completely reversed themselves, and anyone who holds the views that were mainstream 20 years ago is now considered extreme. This kind of rapid, coordinated moral revolution is unprecedented in human history. Something is building towards something. Maybe that's just generational bias speaking. Maybe we're seeing patterns that aren't there, projecting our anxieties onto ancient texts. Or maybe, just maybe, Saint Bridget saw something real about our time. Either way, her call to conversion remains valid. Either way, her warnings deserve our serious attention. Because even if the end isn't near, the end of your life could come at any moment. And the question Bridget's prophecies force us to confront is the same question that has always mattered most. Are you ready? But here's what many people miss when they focus exclusively on the darker, more frightening elements of Bridget's prophecies. She didn't only speak of destruction and judgment, of Antichrist and tribulation. She also spoke repeatedly, insistently, beautifully, of hope. One prophecy attributed to her has gained particular attention among those who study Catholic mystical tradition. Before Antichrist comes, the portals of the faith will be opened to great numbers of pagans. Think about what this means. This isn't a prophecy of defeat or despair. It's a prophecy of victory. Victory before the final struggle, triumph before the ultimate test. Other Catholic mystics across the centuries have echoed this same remarkable theme. Blessed Anna Maria Taizzi, a 19th century Italian mystic whose prophecies have received significant church attention, revealed similar visions. Whole nations will join the church shortly before the reign of the Antichrist. There shall be innumerable conversions of heretics who will return to the bosom of the church. She even specified particular nations. Russia, England, and China will come into the church. Imagine what this would mean. Russia, separated from Rome for nearly 1,000 years, reconciled. England, where Catholicism was outlawed for centuries, returning to communion. China, where 1 billion souls live, largely untouched by the gospel, opening to faith. A great evangelization preceding the final trial. Massive conversions sweeping across nations and continents. The church experiencing a tremendous harvest of souls, possibly the greatest in its 2,000-year history, before the dark days described by the prophets finally arrive. This pattern appears throughout Catholic prophetic tradition. Before the worst comes, there will be a great awakening. Before the Antichrist rises to his terrible 3-year reign, the gospel will spread with new power and effectiveness. Before the final persecution tests the church as she has never been tested, she will experience a period of renewal, growth, and spiritual flourishing. If we're truly approaching the times that Bridget and other mystics described, then we're not just approaching judgment. We're approaching opportunity. We're not just nearing the Antichrist and his reign of deception. We're nearing a moment when great numbers of pagans might enter the faith, when whole nations might turn to Christ, when the church might experience growth that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago. This changes everything about how we should respond to these prophecies. We shouldn't be hiding in bunkers, stockpiling supplies, waiting in fear for catastrophe to strike. We should be preparing for evangelization. We should be readying ourselves, spiritually, intellectually, practically, to welcome the seekers who are coming. We should be deepening our own faith so we can share it effectively with those who will soon be desperate to find it. We shouldn't be paralyzed by fear of what the prophecies describe. We should be energized by the mission they imply. We should be training ourselves to be instruments of the great harvest that the mystics foresaw. The prophecies of warning are meant to wake us up, not to terrify us into inaction, but to galvanize us for the work ahead. So here's the question that matters. Is 2026 really a prophetic year? Did Saint Bridget truly mark our time for divine intervention? The honest answer is, we don't know with certainty. What we know is that Saint Bridget was a genuine mystic, whose prophecies received extraordinary church approval across 7 centuries. What we know is that many of her predictions came true with documented accuracy, including one that wouldn't be verified for 500 years. What we know is that her warnings about the signs preceding the Antichrist describe conditions that increasingly mirror our own world. What we don't know is whether 2026 specifically appears in her authenticated writings, or whether that date has been connected to her through later interpretation. The scholarly evidence for this specific attribution remains uncertain. What we know is that Saint Bridget was a genuine mystic, whose prophecies received extraordinary church approval across 7 centuries. What we know is that many of her predictions came true with remarkable documented accuracy, including some that wouldn't be verified for 500 years after her death. What we know is that her warnings about the signs preceding the Antichrist describe conditions that increasingly, unmistakably mirror our own world. What we don't know is whether 2026 specifically appears in her authenticated writings, or whether that date has been connected to her through later interpretation, compilation, or even confusion with other prophetic sources. The scholarly evidence for this specific attribution remains uncertain. Responsible examination requires us to acknowledge this uncertainty. But perhaps, the specific year matters less than the message it carries. Because whether or not something dramatic happens in 2026 or 2038 or any other specific year, the call remains the same. The call that Bridget spent her entire life proclaiming. The call that echoes from her revelations across 7 centuries to reach our ears today. Conversion, repentance, return to God. These are the responses that Bridget urged upon the people of her own age. Popes and peasants, kings and commoners, the powerful and the forgotten. These are the responses that remain just as urgent, just as necessary, just as transformative today. The young girl who saw Christ on the cross in that cold Swedish chapel spent the remaining 60 years of her life calling humanity back to love. She confronted the most powerful people in Europe with truths they didn't want to hear. She founded a religious order that still exists today. She filled 8 volumes with divine revelations that continue to guide and challenge readers after 700 years. And through it all, through every vision and every prophecy and every warning, the message was beautifully, terrifyingly consistent. God's judgment is real, but God's mercy is infinitely greater. The time to choose is not tomorrow. The time to choose is not when the signs become undeniable. The time to choose is now. If Saint Bridget could speak to us today, to us, living in what might be the very times her visions described, what would she say? I believe she would tell us what Christ told her in that vision 7 centuries ago. I believe she would point to the cross, to the suffering Savior she saw so clearly, so terribly, so beautifully, and say, "Look at him. Look at what love has done. Look at what love endures." And then ask yourself, which side are you on? Because in the end, that's what every prophecy comes down to. Not specific dates, not elaborate predictions, not intricate timelines of tribulation and triumph. Just a choice. The same choice that has been offered to every generation since Christ walked the earth. The same choice that was offered to the people of Nineveh through Jonah, to the Israelites through Moses, to all humanity through the prophets and saints and mystics God has sent throughout history. The choice that's being offered to you right now, in this moment, as you read these words. Saint Bridget of Sweden saw a shocking prophecy for our time. But the most shocking thing about it might not be the warnings of destruction or the signs of the Antichrist or the timeline that some believe points to our era. The most shocking thing might be the mercy that's still available, the doors of grace that remain open, the God who, 700 years after Bridget's death, is still saying through his prophets and saints and through the quiet voice of conscience in every human heart, "Come back to me. It's not too late. The time is now. Come back to me." The question that matters, the only question that truly matters, is, will we listen? Will you?